I saw that. JavaScript is going to destructure and spread. Yeah. Tough crowd. I think I'll leave it for now, but do we need the clip on the recording? Yeah. That's mainly why I'm here, to get the great recording. Cool. If you want to follow along, the slides are available here. Now, ni hao. What's your Lei Shen? No? Lei Shen? Thunder God. I was trying to make up my Chinese name, which kind of basically translating Thor into Lei Shen, if that is correct. But yeah, I work as a developer advocate at Stripe. Stripe, we built payments infrastructure. We have a lovely office not too far away, Anson Road. I think we might actually be hosting next month. So have a look at that, 60 Anson Road, I think Maple Tree, Anson, something like that. And I don't have any plane to catch. The only thing I have to catch is the MRT, and that runs until late, so I'm going to take out the speed a little bit here. And yeah. So yeah, location in Singapore. I recently moved here, I think 4 months ago. So this was actually my first tropical Christmas, which was quite interesting. I missed the Christmas markets. I think that was the only thing I missed. Mulled wine. Cool. Oh yeah. I've also been helping out organizing some meetups. So Jamstack Singapore. If you know me, you know I love Gatsby, static sites, anything that's static on the edge of the internet, and then APIs, JavaScript, lovely. And yeah, GraphQL Singapore. There was the first meetup yesterday, but if you weren't there, check it out on Meetup. We're gonna have some more. And yeah, Jamstack and GraphQL are great friends as well. Cool. Now, I wouldn't actually dare to try and even predict the future of JavaScript. If you know the history of JavaScript, you know it's not a good idea. I'm not going to play this video, but there is this great video, I think it's by Fireship, The History of JavaScript. And it's quite interesting. If you haven't seen it, give that a go. Cool. So, yeah, instead of predicting the future, the reason why I did this talk is basically at the beginning of the year, I love to just kind of sit down, see, okay, what has happened recently in the JavaScript world, and what is likely to come to JavaScript and sort of the adjacent ecosystems. And yeah, just kind of do a little research, see what's going on, maybe learn some new stuff. And so let's start with some TC39 proposals. Actually, does anyone know what ECMA stands for? No? I actually just realized I forgot it as well. It's something European Computer Machinery Association or something. And then eventually they figured out, so it was founded in Switzerland, I think in the 60s. And eventually they figured out there's more to the world than Europe, and so they called it ECMA International now. And so TC39 is the Technical Committee 39, which is working on the standardization of ECMAScript, namely JavaScript. And if you haven't seen this, it's actually pretty cool to sort of click around, have a look. So there's a couple stages for different proposals. Let's see if we can. So we have sort of a proposal, then becomes a draft, kind of a candidate proposal, and eventually stage 4, it is finished. I'm not going to go through this, but what we can do is we can look at some of the finished proposals which are going to make their way into JavaScript in 2020. And one, I think, of my favorites is the, what is it, something chaining, conditional chaining? Have you heard of that? Optional chaining. So if you've worked with JavaScript, you've likely done something like this before, especially if you're fetching data from a server, some kind of deeply nested data where it's like, okay, I want to get my user's street, but I don't actually know if there is even an address, right? And so I actually have to check, do I have an address on my user object? And if so, then I can try and access the street. Now, sometimes if you do this and address is actually undefined, you get a JavaScript error. And so maybe let's actually do this. Open up Node. Let's, do you want to do the honors, maybe?
You want a mug?
Oh, maybe let's try the mug, yeah. Does that work? Hello? Okay, so we're going to have a user object, and we're just going to, have an empty object for now. And let's basically actually try to sort of access the user street address. Type error, cannot read property street of undefined, right? You're familiar with that. But now, if we do this here, the optional chaining operator, what do you think is going to happen? Yes, unexpected token. So the thing is, it's not there yet. And there's a great resource for that actually, which is called node.green, which has a lot of green, but then if we go to, go to chaining, it's not so green yet. But we can see here, we can use the harmony flag. Let's try that. So let's do node. Harmony. So cool. And so we checked, I think since 13.04 version, we can use it. So let's do again our user. And now there's no more JavaScript error, but rather it returns undefined. Isn't that amazing? Just imagine when you write your React components, if you think kind of how often you've got sort of the checking of that in there, it's going to make life so much sweeter now. Cool. Another one that is sort of similar to that is the nullish coalescing operator. So if you've written JavaScript, you also have likely done this quite a bit. So if we have an undefined value, now let's have a look here. Let's copy this. Okay. So let's say we have, generally when you do this, is basically you want to check, is there a value defined? And, for example, if it's undefined, or you want to assign some default value. Now, this becomes problematic when our when our value is 0, for example. So we want to have a number. Let's actually maybe do that here. So we basically want to check, okay, response settings. If we have an animation duration, we want to set it to animation duration, otherwise we want to set it to 400. So now, what do you think is the value of this. $400. Now the problem is 0 in JavaScript is a falsy, is it falsy? What do you say? Value. So that is actually not the outcome we want to get here. Now if we do the same thing, so generally what you would do now is basically you would check, is it type of number, and if it's type of number, all that fun stuff. But now you can do this. Has already been declared. Fair enough. Now let's just copy that. Now we get the actual number value instead of the wrong value. Isn't that amazing? No more type of checking. Now the downside is if you look at this, where was it? If you look at this, so it's gonna probably take a while until that lands. Specifically here, this is only in stage 3 at the moment. But if you use something like TypeScript, for example, you can already make use of these language features because TypeScript can actually compile it to currently usable JavaScript. So some cool thing for TypeScript is there is a TypeScript playground. So maybe let's actually copy that example over. Or we can just do. So we have like equals 0, and then you want to check is duration question mark, and otherwise 400. And now you can see what actually happens, what is being translated to. We actually check if it's void or 0. But eventually all of that won't be needed because in 2020 it's going to be built into JavaScript. Cool. So some resources there. If you look at the slides, you can find the links. Now, moving on. TypeScript. So Carlos has preached the good word of GraphQL and TypeScript and the power of types. It first appeared on the 2016 Stack Overflow survey. Back then, almost half of 1%, almost 0.5% of developers were using TypeScript. Now fast forward 3 years, and TypeScript is actually in the top 10 languages with more than 20% usage. So it looks like people love their types. I've actually recently been converted for types as well, so we released types within the Stripe node library, and it's a game changer. Like, you don't have to look at documentation anymore. Because of the typing, you get basically self-documenting code completion. It's fabulous. So TypeScript, probably 2020, going to see even more of that. Here we can see, I think, what's that, sort of roughly tripled over the past 2 years. Is that correct? Yeah, definitely popular and rising. Here you can see the sort of the Christmas slump. You're going to see that in all the graphs, interestingly enough. People don't seem to work that much over Christmas. Cool, moving on. Some of the web platform APIs that are sort of in experimental stage at the moment. You might have already seen the web authentication API. Pretty cool. Allows the browser access to like physical hardware tokens for authentication. There's a demo here you can click into by Mozilla. So basically, you would register your token device, and you might have seen this before. So this is the native browser window that pops up when you use the web authentication API. Then when I tap my security key here, it's being registered, and then I can actually verify that I didn't even touch it. Maybe my sweat was sort of still giving it power or something interesting. But yeah, there's actually, if you look at the documentation, it is still a bit like the whole encryption piece and all of that sort of goes a bit over my head, but I think the gist is the server creates some random number that is then basically signed with the public key of your hardware token. You then store that signed key on your server, and then later when you want to verify it, you basically do that again. Does it sound about right? Maybe someone wants to give a talk about the mechanics of it. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to move on to the native file system API. I think that's been yeah, that's going to be pretty popular, especially when you're building like Electron apps and things like that, having access to the file system. There's a pretty good resource here, kind of web.dev. I don't know if you've seen that. I think is it by Google? Yeah. That domain is fantastic, web.dev. I have Thor web.dev, which is almost as good. But yeah, so there's a good resource there. But then it's actually not, you can't demo it that well. Where there is a nice demo is the native loading attribute, which now gives us native lazy loading. There have been a ton of lazy loading libraries out there in the past, but now it's natively baked into the browser. And Matthias, who is on the TC39 team, has made this great demo with the kittens. And so what the lazy loading tag does is, instead of loading all the images right away, as the image tag comes into browser view, and I need to go to all here, you can see that as we scroll and our images come into view, we actually then fetching the images from our server just in time. And I mean, if you think about some of the sort of data bandwidth that we get in some countries, that is definitely useful. Cool. So native image loading, another one. And yeah, here you can see, so we're just saying, come on. Loading lazy, and you can do the same for iframes as well. Same tag there. Cool. Moving on to some of the frameworks. One of the newcomers has been Svelte. Who here has heard of Svelte? And keep your hand up if you've used Svelte. Okay, so it's definitely a newcomer. I think it's been around for a bit. But so last year I think early last year, April-ish, Svelte 3.0 came out. It is quite interesting as it doesn't require any dependency. So the idea is you actually compile into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I think the idea is sort of it gets rid of kind of all the clutter and just keeps the good stuff. And so what you can see is the actual output of this is then going to be clutter. But also what's cool here, you can actually switch between DOM and server-side rendering, which is pretty nice. And maybe let's look at some more useful example. Is this interesting? Yeah, so for example, here, like SRC is a shortcut for SRC equals SRC, which is pretty cool. And then also you can do styling in there. And in the end, it's just being compiled down into native code. So no modules, no shadow DOM. Sort of that's what it prides itself with, and therefore, I guess you get pretty good speeds. Maybe definitely something to watch in 2020. And yeah, it's been growing. It's been growing a bit, kind of over the past 2 years. But moving on to some of the more popular ones, Angular, React, and Vue. I think you can see React is definitely sort of the most popular here. Kind of, I think even more than double than Angular and Vue combined. Although growth, that doesn't look like a lot of growth, but maybe the scale is pretty big. Anyway, what's new? Did you get that picture? Or?
Thanks.
Okay. That's a pretty cool tool, actually. You can, what's the website called? You can compare sort of the NPM package downloads and get the charts. Trends, NPM trends. It's great tool. Makes your slides instantly beautiful. What's new? Angular, apparently Ivy. I'm not really in the Angular world. Anyone excited about Ivy? Okay, nope. No Angular. Yes? Okay. So Ivy is Angular's new compiler or rendering engine, something like that. Now, did I note down why it was new compiler? No. Why it is interesting, I forgot. But maybe if you read the article. But what's more exciting for me is Angular finally has a static site generator. So maybe if someone wants to look into that and present at the next Jamstack meetup, definitely do that. So it's called Scully, I think Scully.io. And yeah, I mean it's early days, but still exciting. Moving on to React. Have you been hooked? Everyone loves hooks. Who loves hooks? Okay. Hooks, fantastic. I personally don't like classes, so anything that can be functions, yes please. I also prefer factory methods before new object classes. So yes, functions every day. So hooks is great because we can now use state and effect hooks in our functional components, so we don't need the class stuff anymore. And another thing that is sort of in experimental mode at the moment is the concurrent mode, which basically allows concurrent updates, so updates to the state at the same time. And you can imagine it basically like a Git workflow with branches. So you branch off the state and you eventually merge the state back together. And so now you can actually update the state concurrently. So that's pretty exciting, and that has paved the way to the new suspense. Suspense is quite interesting for data fetching. So if you've done data fetching in React before, you've likely had sort of some, loading question mark, show spinner component, otherwise, show my actual component. And so suspense actually allows us to do this declaratively. So we can say, okay, suspense, if we're loading, show our spinner, otherwise the profile page. And there's also a nice demo for this here. Let's see. So maybe if we reload that, you can see here that first we're loading the profile, and then we're loading the post, and is really nice and readable, so that's pretty cool. Suspense, awesome. And Vue, I personally don't work a lot with Vue, but so apparently what's new is the composition API, which exposes some of Vue's core capabilities like reactive state as functions. And so the great thing about that apparently is kind of allows you to sort of write cleaner components, especially at scale, and also it allows easier typing of these components. And as we've learned earlier, it's all about the types in 2020. So that's pretty cool. Anyone who uses Vue? Vue popular? Okay, some. Have you heard of the composition API? Nice. Is it good? Okay, cool. Maybe tell us at the end of the year if it was great. Not forget Node.js. So I think one sort of downside of JavaScript that often is being sort of pointed out is the single threadedness of JavaScript. So with worker threads, we can actually execute JavaScript in parallel by managing different worker threads. So that's quite exciting. ES modules. So since Node 13, we have native module support. So we can use import and export instead of the require statements in Node. And lastly, Nest.js has been very popular in 2019, has been growing. It's kind of a server-side Node framework. Have you heard of Nest? Okay. So yeah, again, apparently good TypeScript support. I think it's also written using TypeScript, and then also GraphQL support, but by wrapping Apollo server. So that seems to be pretty exciting. Now, moving on, native mobile. So React Native versus NativeScript versus Ionic. I think growth has been pretty flat here. Also, what has happened to NativeScript? Anyone know? Anyone use NativeScript? No. Okay, I don't know either. But not much has happened. React Native, we've gotten fast refresh. Basically, kind of allows us to get near instant feedback, they call it. And then Ionic has now React support. If you used Ionic before, you might know it was all about Angular, but now Ionic React is here. Does anyone use Ionic? Okay. Lastly, some emerging technologies. I'm not sure I bucketed SwiftUI there as emerging, but SwiftUI sort of allows you to build declarative UIs similar to React, but with the Swift programming language. So if you, it is limited to iOS though. So potentially more interesting, Flutter, which uses, comes out of Google and uses the Dart programming language, which is syntactically sort of similar to JavaScript. And here, if you look at the state of the Octoverse report from GitHub, Dart has actually been the fastest growing language in 2019. 2018 to 2019. Somewhere there. And what's interesting, so Dart has now in beta support for the web as a target. So potentially you can actually just write your whole, apps and web in Dart. So maybe that's interesting. Lastly, maybe more excitingly, at the beginning of December, the World Wide Web Consortium has officially taken WebAssembly into, I guess the fourth official language for the web. I've linked some resources there that I found interesting. I think what sort of tripped me up a little was kind of WebAssembly as the fourth language. And I was like, don't you write? Basically, with WebAssembly, you write in like C, C++, Rust, whatever. But the idea is that you write in these languages, you compile it to WebAssembly, and then WebAssembly actually allows you, using JavaScript, you can then access your code that you've written in C, C++ on the web platform. So I guess it is a language that C and the other languages compile to. Yeah, interesting. I haven't looked into it myself, but I'd love to learn more. So if anyone wants to give a talk at the next talk.js meetup, talk about WebAssembly, would be awesome. That's it from me, but I'd love to hear, if we have time, what are you most excited about in 2020 for JavaScript? So JSConf is happening again this year, sometime this year? Next year? This year. Sometime this year. Anyone else? Something? Anyone excited? No one excited?
You just shouted at us. Huh?
Do I hear WebAssembly? Yeah, that's exciting.
Another top, the advice last year was not to use it.
Oh, okay. So maybe I can look that up on Engineer Strategy. What was the title? Don't use WebAssembly?
No. I'll send it to you.
Okay, cool. Anyway, thanks everyone. Hopefully you're somewhat excited about 2020.